Okay, then, welcome to this Q&A session for ICALP. And this is ICALP slot D1, and we have 6 papers in this slot. And so the way this is supposed to work is we will discuss each of these papers. Roughly 10 minutes was the rule given out by the organizers. So I'm not going to be very strict about this. So if there's more to discuss for one paper, we will happy to discuss longer a bit. So and we proceed with the papers in the order that is given by the organizers. So the way this works is that for each paper, we will have a roughly 2-minute outline by one of the authors who's here. And then we will continue to the Q&A session where we can ask questions and the authors hopefully can answer. The way this should work, I think, is that, I mean, we're not overly many participants here in the Zoom meeting. So I would suggest that if someone has a question, simply unmute yourself and ask the question. So I don't think we need like holding up hands or fancy technology from Zoom. At least let's hope or let's try, and then let's see how this works. So this brings us to our first paper. The first paper is 3 Polymatrix games are PPAD-hard, and it's presented by Argyrios Delikas. So Argyrios, maybe you can give us a brief outline of the paper.
Hello. My plan at least is to go diagonally over my presentation and highlight some things there. And okay, can you see my slides? Perfect. So this is a joint work with John Fernley and Rahul Savani from Liverpool. And since I assume that the majority of the participants here know what a game is, I can go directly to the actual game. Polymatrix game is defined over a graph where every vertex corresponds to a player and each edge denotes a 2-player game played between these 2 players. And in order to play the game, each node chooses a strategy and plays the same strategy over all 2-player games they participate in. And the payoff is the sum of the payoffs over all independent Polymatrix games. So here, player 2 participates in 3 games, with 1, with 4, and with 3, and he has 2 strategies. And here are the payoffs for the players. These are the bimatrix games. And the goal of this paper is to study the complexity of finding a nice equilibrium in this kind of games when the underlying graph is a tree. Why trees are interesting? It's mainly from a theoretical point of view because, okay, let me highlight first that any bimatrix game is a tree. But what we are focusing on polymatrix games with constant number of actions. Why this is important and interesting? Because all the current known PPAD hardness results for equilibrium computation were using somehow directly or indirectly polymatrix games, and the crucial bit for their correctness was the existence of cycles. So we said, okay, what's going on if we have only trees? And the complexity class that we're going to use is PPAD, and PPAD, if a problem is PPAD-hard, then it is considered to be interactable in the sense that it's unlikely to have a polynomial time algorithm. Another interesting and related class of problem is linear fixed P, where there the goal is to find a fixed point of a piecewise linear continuous function. And what it has been shown is that linear fixed equals PPAD, and there is a line of work on these topics. So the majority of results of PPAD hardness results used Polymatrix games as their gadgets. And here, actually, somehow recently, Rubinstein proved that computing an epsilon and approximate mass equilibrium in bipartite binary action Polymatrix games is PPAD-hard. And on the other hand, there are positive results. And here, for constant action 3 Polymatrix games, there was initially a QP-task and then an FP-task for the problem. So it was open whether we can actually find a mass equilibrium efficiently. What we showed that constant action Polymatrix games are actually PPAD-hard. And by constant, we have a real nice small constant, which is 20. And the graph has to be relatively simple. Actually, this is the graph that we need in order to derive our PPAD hardness results. By the way, Martin, if I go over time, feel free to interrupt me. And if you have any questions, any of the participants, feel free to ask. And another interesting result is we showed that finding an approximate fixed point for two-dimensional, for 2D linear, piecewise linear functions is PPAD-hard. And this actually, it's a nice result because we show that even for epsilon 0.2, in order to get a feeling about this result, I should say that when epsilon is half, then it's trivially, we can find a trivial solution. And we showed that when epsilon is this large constant is PPAD-hard to find a solution.
Yeah,
okay.
so let me say, okay, so this is let's say a good point to remind ourselves of these results. So so let's maybe jump in with some questions. So I can maybe start, and you guys can ask questions by unmuting yourself and asking anytime. So you prove these two reductions essentially, right? From this epsilon 3 Brouwer to the 2D Brouwer, and then from 2D
Yes.
Brouwer to 2D Polymatrix.
Yes.
So so what do you think is the, let's say, like technically the bigger challenge of these two? What was the bigger challenge of these two?
Okay. The biggest challenge was, let me go here. There were several challenges, to be honest, and the first challenge was to prove that that two-dimensional Brouwer is hard even when the arithmetic circuit that defines the problem has constant width. So in order to do this, we had to define some gadgets and interpret these gadgets and do computations in very low level, and we had to count the number of variables that we needed, because in the end, what we needed is that the number of variables that we need would correspond to the number of strategies. The second difficult and technical thing was how to embed the arithmetic circuit, how to represent the arithmetic circuit via a 3 Polymatrix game without the use of cycles. And this was done by creating suitable gadgets. Luckily for us, the gadgets were the majority of the gadgets were used were defined in Daskalaki's Goldberg and Papadimitriou seminal paper. So we had to implement only some of the gadgets. So these are our own gadgets where the mixing players. So let me highlight this. So the Polymatrix game, the Polymatrix game, has a very special structure. We have, if you remember, we have a variable, we have an arithmetic circuit, and we want to simulate this arithmetic circuit. This arithmetic circuit deals with some variables, and there are some constraints between the variables. So we have created players for the variables, we have created players for the constraints, and we have created players that actually guarantee that all the equalities that we want to satisfy are satisfied.
I think Kosha had a question to this. Kosha.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, so you've shown that for 2D linear fixed P, you kind of finding an epsilon fixed point for epsilon being 0.20, whatever it is hard. And on the other hand, 0.5 is trivial. So what do you suspect is the right answer here? Do you suspect that it's actually any fixed constant less than 0.5 is going to be hard, or do you think it's actually something sort of in the middle there?
Actually, this is, I'll give the standard answer. This is a very good question, but if I had to guess, I would say that for any constant less than 0.5, I suspect that it would be hard. But
okay,
this is my own conjecture. I have no intuition. I have no evidence towards this, but it would be really interesting to get such inapproximability result.
Thanks. Thank you.
Maybe a follow-up question on this. Is there sort of some other consequences for other problems beyond 3 Polymatrix games from this 2D Brouwer hardness with constant width?
We didn't manage to find such a consequence, but I would expect that this particular hardness result will serve as a starting point for other PPAD hardness proofs in the future.
Okay, cool. Are there other questions?
So maybe a short question. So if I understand correctly, like Rubinstein showed that for binary actions in bipartite Polymatrix games, epsilon approximate equilibria are hard.
Yes, for some constant epsilon, yes.
Yeah, but for like 3 Polymatrix games, there is an FP-TAS, right? Or...
Yes, there is an FP-TAS that, yes.
So when like do you suspect that things get hard? Like if you add like one cycle to the graph, like should it become difficult, or what's the intuition there?
Okay, I can tell you some other things here that whenever we have our knowledge for positive results is rather limited. Whenever the only actual polynomial time algorithms are by Elkind, Goldberg, and Goldberg, where the graphs are very simple, that it's either binary action paths, so we have only one line and every player has 2 actions, or we have a cycle where again every player has 2 actions. We tried hard to find a polynomial time algorithm for binary action trees. And I suspect that when the tree has a constant degree, we can constant degree binary action and constant degree, we can find the Nash equilibrium efficiently. But even for 3 actions, we don't know anything. It's a very strange problem.
Good. Further questions?
Maybe it's a good thing to go to my last slide and highlight the other questions. Actually, yeah, we have already discussed all of them.
Good. So if there are no more further questions, then, well, let's thank Agurios for being here and answering to our questions. Right. So,
Thank you.
Virtual applause, I think. Yeah, I see it. Okay, good. Then let's move on to the second paper in the list, which is Existence and Complexity of Approximate Equilibria in Weighted Congestion Games. Again, let's have a 2 to 5 minute presentation or a discussion of the result, and then we're going to go over and ask questions.
Yeah, so can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, thank you very much, Martin, for the introduction. And in a nutshell, our paper is about trying to find equilibria in games, just like the previous talk. Here we are actually concerned about pure Nash equilibrium, and we are looking in the framework of congestion games. So congestion games are, I would say, a standard framework for the study of equilibria, and essentially the property is that on each resource of this game, the cost of this resource is just a function of the total amount of players using the resource and not specifically which players are using it. And for the unweighted case, so when our players have the same weight, we know that pure Nash equilibria always exists. This was known since the 70s. But in general, for the weighted case, exact equilibria are not guaranteed to exist. And therefore, from a computer science perspective, the notion that we can look at is that of an approximate equilibria, or alpha PNE, where this alpha kind of quantifies how much we are willing to lose on our equilibrium guarantee. So let me just briefly mention what was known before. As I said, we already knew that the exact equilibria do not exist. And in fact, there was a hardness result. So we knew that the exact decision problem was also NP-hard. So given a weighted congestion game, it was NP-hard to decide whether it had an exact equilibrium. And within this line of works, many people have now looked at polynomial congestion games, so where the cost functions are polynomials of degree at most d. And we get some positive results there. So we know that approximate equilibria exist for alpha equal to d, where d is the maximum degree of a polynomial. And on the negative side, the only thing we knew was a constant lower bound. So we knew that 1.153 equilibria did not exist. And this was from the work of Hardness et al. So what we did in our paper was essentially we worked on this lower bound, and we were able to extend this, and now we were able to prove that essentially square root d approximate equilibria are not guaranteed to exist in weighted congestion games. So that was like the first contribution. The second contribution was actually, we also translated this non-existence result into a hardness result. So not only approximate equilibria are not guaranteed to exist, it's actually NP-hard to decide whether a weighted congestion game has such an approximate equilibrium. And I mean, another contribution that we did was also look at a case where you have general cost functions, not just polynomials. And here we prove that n approximate equilibria exist, where n is the number of players. We got the lower bound of n over log n. And again, this lower bound also translates into a hardness, an NP hardness bound. And finally, to conclude, I'll just leave here some open questions from our work. The first obvious one is whether we'll be able to narrow down this gap that still exists between d and square root d. And to be honest, I cannot commit to think that one or the other will be the actual tight answer. Maybe the answer is somewhere in between. And the second question that we think is very interesting to think about is about the complexity of finding equilibria when we know that they exist. So we know that d approximate equilibria always exist, and we actually know that d to the d approximate equilibria can be computed efficiently by a polynomial time algorithm. This is from Dutu-Karagiannis et al. But in the middle, there's like this exponential gap where we don't know what's the complexity of finding an equilibrium. We just know that they exist. And I would argue there is a natural candidate for this class, which is PLS, the class of polynomial local search problems, because essentially the existence result that we have involves a potential argument or a local search argument. And yeah, that's all I wanted to say in this short time. Thanks.
Yeah, great. That would also be my first question. So, I mean, there's several issues in here, right? So there's the complexity issue and the existence issue. So do you think existence in terms, let's say existence in terms of d approximate equilibria is the answer, or is there some hope that like with the existing techniques or like in general things can be improved in terms of the approximation factor, at least in terms of existence?
Yeah, what I can say is that actually the question for existence and the question for hardness will give you the same result. That's one of the cool things that our paper does, is that this hardness, essentially the hardness doesn't care about the particular instance that you construct. So as long as you build a game that does not have, alpha approximate equilibria, you can just take this game, whatever it is, and put it in the reduction, and you'll immediately get hardness also of deciding the approximate equilibrium. So in other words, this boundary, the boundary from non-existence to existence, also gives you an NP hardness guarantee immediately. And to answer now your question, so to be honest, I don't believe that D will be the tight answer. And actually, if you look at the proof that gives this D approximate, you see that it's not exactly D. It's something smaller than D, but it's it's of the order of D, but it's not exactly D. So if it was exactly D, then maybe this will be evidence that mathematics is elegant and maybe this is the right answer. But it's not exactly D. So I would probably suspect maybe it should be more like the square root of D, although I don't really have evidence there.
I have a question.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Can you go one slide back? Or okay.
Here.
So if I understood correctly, the hardness results that you got is for polynomial congestion games, or not?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
So essentially, the hardness comes from the coefficients A0, A1, AD, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what about if we do not have so strange coefficients, but the coefficients are coming from a distribution, have some property or something like that? Can we prove that the existence of approximate equilibria, this D becomes much lower? I mean,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
what do you think?
So in our reduction, these coefficients ADs, AI that you mentioned,
yeah,
they grow exponential, right? Because I mean that's kind of necessary for the reduction. So maybe you have one resource that has this A, and then the next resource has the A multiplied by some factor, and this gets multiplied out and out. So of course, if all the coefficients are polynomially bounded, then that would be an interesting question, because we know that if these are polynomially bounded, then for example, for the unweighted case, we could get that you can find an equilibrium in polynomial time. So this will kind of answer this other question about the hardness of computing.
And actually, my question boils down there. Actually, if you can bypass this hardness by making some assumptions about the coefficients.
Yeah, that would be a very cool question, and maybe you could even prove something like, I don't know, if you have some kind of like smoothness of existence, like
something like that. Yeah, something like that.
These counterexamples, they take this chain of large gaps between the coefficients, and if they come from a distribution, it might be that this kind of collapses. That would be also a very interesting thing to look at, actually.
What is known for like certain strategy spaces? I guess your strategy spaces also need some kind of generality to produce this result, or not? So if you restrict your strategy spaces to, I don't know, some combinatorial structure.
Yeah. So I can maybe go a little bit at the reduction. So essentially for the non-existence gadget, we only need 2 strategies per player. So each player only has A strategy or B strategy. So they are given combinatorially. So it's not like they are given as like paths on a graph. Maybe this could also be doable, but I mean, we looked at it in this combinatorial manner. But I mean, the good thing is that you only have 2 strategies per player. And for the hardness construction, you also have essentially 2 strategies per player, because you used it by simulating a circuit, and then each player will either play like the 0 bit of that gate or the 1 bit of that gate. So in our reductions and in the non-existence, essentially you have a small constant number of actions per player. That's kind of the structure of our construction.
Maybe if I can follow up on Martin's question. So, because there are cases known where even exact equilibria exist, is that correct? Like for Matroids or something like that?
Yeah.
So, I mean, like, do you think that there might be like other, I'm not exactly sure what is known here, but like, do you suspect that there will be like a lot of other combinatorial classes for which like exact or like approximate equilibria with small alpha are known? Or? So is there anything else beyond Matroids, or?
I mean, I to be honest, I never thought too much about the combinatorial aspect. I mean, there are, for example, singleton congestion games that have some nice properties, and there also equilibria exist. So here is like the strategies, you can only play singleton sets. Another also case where we look at the existence of equilibria is now if we change the cost functions, right? And here we know that, for example, if t equals 1, so if your cost functions are affine, then we also know that weighted equilibria, exact equilibria exists for weighted games. And there's also, if these are actual exponential functions, we also know that they exist. And essentially, these are the only 2 cases where we can guarantee exact existence of equilibria.
Further questions? Doesn't seem to be the case. Well, then, thanks for the Q&A and for the short presentation, and let's thank you virtually.
Thank you for the nice questions.
Okay, then let's move on to the next next entry here, which is Knapsack secretary with Bursty Adversary. Thomas.
Yes, I'm looking for my slides and they somehow gone. Give me a second. Prepared everything, but now it's gone. There it is. I hope you can hear me and I hope you can see me.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm presenting joint work with Marco Molinaro on Knapsack secretary with Bursty Adversary. And we are actually, in my presentation, I'm actually only focusing on the multiple choice secretary problem rather than the more general Knapsack secretary problem. In the multiple choice secretary problem, you see a sequence of n numbers, and out of those you may choose up to k. And whenever you see a number, you have to immediately and irrevocably decide whether you want to accept or reject the current number that you're seeing without knowing the future. And it is an easy exercise to see that, well, if an adversary chooses these values and the order, then this is a completely hopeless task. But if an adversary chooses only the values, but the order is random, meaning a uniformly drawn permutation, then you can get quite good results, and you can even get closer and closer to the optimum as k, the number of selections that you can make, grows. But what we were wondering was, well, what if actually the sequence is only mostly random order, but here and there something unforeseen happens. So here and there, there's something which is actually induced by an adversary. And to model this, we introduced this Bursty adversary plus random order model, in which we have an adversary which first chooses, well, that some of the rounds will be adversarial, and for these it chooses an item, and then for the other rounds it only chooses a set of items, but not which rounds they are assigned to, because this is what nature does in the second step. So nature then in the second step draws a uniform permutation for all these random order items and assigns these to the remaining rounds. And then we have a sequence which is, well, partially random order, partially adversarial, and our algorithm sees this one item at a time without actually knowing whether it is currently seeing an adversarial or a random order item. And then we need some further assumptions I have to skip over. And for this, we then introduce an algorithm, which is, in contrast to the other algorithms, gives us at least some guarantee, and it gives us quite a good guarantee, meaning that we get closer and closer to the random order optimum with our selection if the number of selections that we're allowed to make grows, and we have some further burstiness assumption on the adversary, which, well, I can talk about if any of you is interested. But the important thing is we are comparing selections in the random order rounds also to the random order optimum, and whatever happens in these adversarial rounds, we also ignore for the benchmark because, well, just because otherwise the adversary could make everything that happens in the random order rounds worthless and only present something of any value in the adversarial rounds. And yes, let's leave it at that for the time being. Are there any questions?
Yes, thank you. Questions, anyone?
I have a question again.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
So I think I missed something in the model. Does the algorithm know which steps are adversarial and which are not?
It does not, because otherwise this would be a trivial task. So it does not, it just sees a sequence, and well, some of this is coming from the adversary directly, some of this is from these random order rounds, but the algorithm cannot distinguish between the two, just because if it could, then this would be, you could just say, okay, only on the random order rounds I now run in a random order algorithm, but just because I don't know this, I cannot do this. And this also makes algorithms fail in this setting, even if you have like let me go to this example. Even if you have like some adversarial rounds only at the very beginning, this distracts even most algorithms, because then you present them something super valuable at the beginning, and then, well, they are so spoiled that they don't want to select anything later in the sequence.
Thanks.
Kosha.
I was wondering, do you have a kind of story associated with this model that would say it's a realistic model in some setting where you're kind of trying to solve these kinds of kind of online secretary type problems? What setting are you thinking of for this? It's a bit confusing what might have motivated this. That's, I guess, what I'm trying to ask you.
That's actually a good question, and I'm pretty sure I won't be able to give a satisfactory answer to this, but let me still try. Often this is like modeled as one reason to assume this random order is that you have some customers showing up, and they just show up pretty randomly, and they just from a large population, you see one in every round. But this is fine as long as the outer circumstances do not change. But then if suddenly something changes, and only for a few minutes, then suddenly existing algorithms do break down. And we wanted to capture this in an easy model where, well, there's at least something happening that is unforeseen in terms of the random order. But I don't have an excellent story so far. I think this is actually still an open problem for me. What very meaningful models would be like, that actually are assuming less than a fully random order sequence, but still allow us to derive these good guarantees that we are able to derive under a fully random order, or something close to that.
Okay, Shedden, please.
Yeah, I might have missed this. I apologize if I did, but to what extent do you think this can generalize to Matroids and other set systems?
Excellent question. So extending this to Matroids might be possible. Of course, well, then I don't have to tell you, you would have to solve the Matroid secretary problem, but when you wanted to get this down to a constant factor. What we were interested in here was like this setting where you have, where you're actually getting very close to the optimal solution. So we allow, in this setting, it's kind of easier, or to some extent easier, because you can do wrong things every once in a while, because you have these k chances, and it's not quite clear how this then generalizes to other settings. But yeah, if you're talking about Matroids, for example, this is actually a good question of whether there is actually a generalization to this multiple choice secretary problem also to Matroid constraints.
I guess I was thinking, is it possible that there's kind of a reduction to the Matroid secretary problem on any given Matroid? Is that something that you thought about?
I don't currently see any. I think this is an easier, it's difficult to say that, because for some reason, all these knapsack problems, and even if you have general packing constraints, for some reason this is easier than Matroid constraints. Maybe it is because we can do the usual randomized rounding works. So you just can use, for example, concentration bounds, which you usually cannot do if you have Matroid constraints.
I guess my question when I was seeing the video was also in a similar direction, but I guess maybe easier because you're using this window approach and you're sort of using the K choice really to sort of every once in a while also make a wrong decision. So that reminded me of these sort of B matching models where you have sort of items and each item comes with B copies and these things. Do you think this is a case where this would sort of translate more directly?
Yeah, that is certainly something which I could picture that this works for. So if you have for every candidate in your sequence, you can assign it, you can match it to one of many offline vertices, and but each offline vertex can match K times, then actually this the standard random order result just fully generalizes, and it would be interesting to see what you can actually achieve in this model here. It's not quite clear how to deal with this, because then the usual way you would argue there is just if you have a fully random order, then you always argue that, well, everything up to this condition on which items arrived up to this point, but not their order, and then their order is again just a uniformly random permutation. And exactly these kinds of arguments you cannot do here. And this is why such a setting is much more involved than a usual random order.
Yeah, interesting. More questions?
So if one, oh.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, I mean, do you expect that this is like a strictly harder model in the sense that there is like some downward closed set system for which you can say get like a constant competitive in the uniform random arrival model, but like no constant competitive algorithm in this sort of arrival model? Or do you somehow expect that, like, if you have, say, a Matroid with like a constant competitive algorithm, that it probably will also extend to this setting? Or like,
to some extent, this might even be true for this particular setting where K equals 1. There was a related paper which was actually inspired by ours in ICTS this year. And I think they showed that for K equals 1, in a similar setting, you cannot actually do anything unless you impose some further restricting assumptions. So it might even be that here with K equals 1, you cannot do anything really. In contrast to the fully random order, which would be just the secretary problem.
Good. Then, if there are no more further questions, let's thank Thomas for being here and for presenting his paper. Thank you very much. And then let's move on to the next entry, which is node max cut and the complexity of equilibrium and linear weighted congestion games.
Okay, let me share my screen. Okay, so this paper is about PLS, polynomial local shares, which is a class that captures local shares problems. And it's a very well-studied class that contains many problems, such as circuit flip, where we have a circuit and we want to find the locally minimizing output under the flip heuristic. There is also local max, which is PLS complete, where we seek a locally optimal graph under the flip heuristic, where no vertex can flip at its cut and improve the value of the cut, as well as the computation of pure equilibria in congestion games. Now, the question we want to answer here is whether PLS hardness, which is a very well-studied concept, can arise even in simpler settings. Specifically, we consider whether it can arise only from player weights. In all the previous cases, PLS hardness needs the existence of different edge weights in local max cut or the different resource weights in the congestion games to arise. What we are going to do here is get PLS hardness only from the weights themselves. So our results here are that weighted congestion games are PLS-hard, even in series parallel nets. Series parallel nets are a very simple network topology where the unweighted case can be solved in linear time. Moreover, we saw that weighted congestion games are PLS-hard, even when we have identity delays. This means that the resources are all of the form f to x equals x. So there are no coefficients here. Note also that weighted congestion games are all guaranteed to have exact equilibria in the case of very specific families of functions. For example, on linear functions. To prove these results, we also have this cute little problem, which we call node max cut, which is the following problem. We are given a vertex-weighted graph, and to each edge we assign the product of the two weights at its endpoint, which is then a max cut instance. Equivalently, one can see that the game as each player sees his neighbors, for example, vertex number 10 here sees two neighbors with weight 11 and 9 and is in equilibrium in this case. Here is an overview for reductions where we prove that the PLS completeness of series parallel weight congestion games with linear delays is derived from local max cut, which is a classical problem. But for the identity delays case, we need to reduce from our new problem local node max cut, which is itself shown to be PLS complete through reduction from circuit flip. So this is an overview of our reductions. We're taking questions now.
Okay, thank you. Any questions for Nikos?
Something?
Sure.
Thanks for the presentation. When you do this reduction to local node max cut, and I mean it's probably a rather simple question, but do you know that it's also NP-hard, the global version of this problem?
Of local node max cut.
Yeah.
Yes, because the reduction from SAT to max cut applies to local node max cut as well.
Okay, I see.
Because all the edges are equal to 1 in the SAT reduction.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah. And do you think that this, the fact that you prove that local node max cut is PLS hard, do you think that this problem might be useful in to prove PLS hardness of other problems in the future?
Perhaps, I cannot say, but the goal here is to prove not only for exact equilibria, for approximate equilibria. Mm-hmm. That is the ultimate goal.
Yeah, that was also my question when I saw this talk was like, how much is this node max cut version useful beyond congestion games? How far is this and like a problem of independent interest that can be used to prove other interesting PLS hardness results? And in particular, can it be used for approximate equilibria? Like having seen the talk by Diogo, I was like, okay, can this be useful for the open questions they're having in terms of PLS hardness of the approximate Nash equilibria?
Well, we don't know yet whether it can be shown from this problem, but we use some interesting techniques from the reduction from circuit flip, which only make use of weights instead of edges. So maybe they can be used to get PLS hardness from the weights themselves. The techniques used to reduce from circuit flip.
Can I ask?
Sure.
How strange are the weights in the reduction?
It's like they're exponentially different, just like the reduction from to local max cut. What do you mean strange?
No, it's not a criticism. It's just to understand the reduction. I mean, if I have small constants, if I have small constants, the problem I can solve it efficiently via the local search algorithm. But
no, they are very strange. We have very small nodes connected with very large nodes. They're with exponential differences.
Okay, good.
So what happens on like extension parallel networks? Can you do it in polynomial time then, or?
For the unweighted case, yes, you can. But we tried to reduce to extension parallel instead of series parallel, but there are some difficulties there. We don't know yet the answer to weight congestion games to extension parallel.
But you think it's hard, and not that it's like polytime?
My intuition is that it's hard. I don't have any evidence.
Can I take this question?
Sure.
Yeah, I believe it's not hard, but it's difficult to prove it. So my intuition is different from that of Nikos.
Yeah, no, I would also expect it's easy because for some reason all things are easy.
It's surprisingly difficult to find the right algorithm there.
Okay, interesting. Thank you.
Further questions for Nikos?
Thank you for the questions.
Actually, I have a follow-up comment.
Yes.
That maybe if you have negative weights as well, okay, it does not make sense in the specific context, but as a graph theoretic problem, it makes sense. If you have negative weights on the nodes, maybe you can prove the PLS hardness even with small constant weights. It's just a remark.
Possibly. Maybe.
Okay, additional questions? Doesn't seem to be the case. Well, then thank you, Nikos, for your presentation and being here in the Q&A. Thank you. Okay, so much for the congestion games. Now let's move on to mechanism design and to obviously strategy-proof single-minded combinatorial auctions. Carmen.
Thanks, Martin. Can you see? I suppose you can see the slides.
Yeah.
I see a red. Okay, so this is a joint work with Bart de Keyser and Maria Kiropoulou, and I've prepared only one slide, in which I would like to go through all the terms in the title of the paper. So our focus is on combinatorial auctions, which is the problem which we have an auctioneer, some bidders, and some items to allocate to the bidders. And our task is that of coming up with the auction rules. I want to call them auction rules, which means what protocol do we use to decide who's going to win what and how much they're going to be paying for that. So once we get what the bidders will do, we'll try to get as many of the items they'd like for as little as possible. Okay, so they like if they think this is profitable. So this explains the combinatorial auction setting in the mechanism design framework. The single-minded means that these bidders are really only interested in one set of items. So this particular girl over here, she only wants this green set here. She values this bundle 350 euros. And as I said before, she thinks that's better for her to declare a different valuation, a different number, or even a difference. She might do that. And now, so you might all be familiar with single-minded combinatorial auction. Now comes the major novelty of this work, which is about obviously strategy proofness. So what is the observation that people do empirically is that if you do run second price auction, so this is the famous Vicary auction for which Vicary won Nobel Prize, in practice with real people, what you notice is that they try to strategize more, or in other words, lie more, when the auction is run as a sealed bid auction, than when you run this auction as an ascending price. So this is because people are imperfectly rational, so they don't perceive that sealed bid auctions are actually truthful, so they try to cheat. Whilst it's easier for them to understand that ascending price auction it's useless to cheat. So what Sheng-Wu Li did some years back is to formalize this difference of perceiving when it's harder or easy to understand in the concept of obviously strategy proofness. So what we do in this paper then is to design new mechanisms for single-minded combinatorial auctions in both the cases in which the bidders can lie about the valuation and the set. This is known as a jargon as unknown bidders. And the easier case in which the bidders can only lie about the number, so the valuation. So when you talk about obviously strategy-proofness, you need to design a protocol. It's not just an algorithm, because as we just discussed, the way in which you implement an auction is important. So you're gonna have to be careful in the way you compute the outcome. So it's also important how you get to the computation of the outcome. And the good news is that, I mean, as many reviewers have told me in the past, obviously strategy proof is extremely hard, so you're never going to get any good positive result. But in this case, for single-minded combinatorial auctions, we can see that the kind of bounds you get, they're not horrible, because they are comparable with the kind of bounds you can get with strategy proof mechanisms. And that's all I wanted to say for these 2 minutes. There are a number of open problems, but yeah, I'll stop here for now.
Okay, thank you very much. Questions?
So maybe a very stupid question, but like I don't know much about obviously strategy proofness, but is somehow the intuition that it's easier to convince like a participant in an auction that
yeah, exactly,
things are the right thing to do, so to say, or
yeah. So the technical definition says that when a bidder or an agent needs to take a decision, okay, so what strategy should I play? The comparison is that the best possible outcome this bidder can get when she cheats is worse than the worst possible outcome I can get when I'm truthful. So you get this kind of, you know, in the worst possible scenario when I'm truthful, and in the best possible scenario when I lie. So this should be easy to understand for a player. Now, Lee also proves that this exactly captures a particular kind of imperfect rationality, which is absent of you know, no ability to do contingent reasoning. So when you take a decision, then you're not able to do if and else cases in your head. So for this kind of, if you want to have mechanisms that work for people without contingent reasoning skills, obviously strategy proofness is the right concept. And it exactly explains this difference here.
So I was listening to the talk and also looking into the paper. Correct me when I'm wrong, but so a grain of salt that came to my mind was, are these mechanisms polytime, like this two approximation?
Yeah, so this is a different issue. So now we don't care about running time. Okay, so we're just trying to understand what's you know, where we can get with obviously strategy proofness. Now, when you talk about running time here, you have two components. You have, if you like, the extensive form game, which is this thing here, that has a complexity of its own, plus how long does it take to compute the algorithm in the leaves, which is when you got to the point in which you know how much the bidders like the sets. So now, if I care about what's only in the leaves, and for example, I look at the square root of m, this is a classical loss greedy algorithm, that's polynomial time. But then you need to add also the complexity of getting to the leaf. But yeah, this is certainly a place in which we want to be if we do have good approximation.
So do you think the two can also be, I mean, the two is for two valuations, right? You have this low and high, and then you make these, if I remember correctly, you make these independent set computations.
So this is not polynomial time, for example.
So do you think there is a way to make this polynomial time and keep the two?
Yeah, it's a good, I don't know. That's a good question. Probably not, but this is just a guess. And as you know, having computational lower bound for mechanism design, it's even harder. I mean, already for strategy proofness. So I wouldn't know how to prove that, but yeah.
Can this extend to like more general combinatorial auctions, like K-minded or things like this?
No, and this is also a point that it's important to make. So the unknown sets is a multidimensional setting because bidders can lie about two objects. And this is the first known case in which you can do OSP for multidimensional bidders. Usually the way you do, or agents, the way you do OSP is always separating one extreme of the domain from the rest. Now, in multidimensional settings, you don't have an extreme, right? So that's why it's very hard. And the trick here was that we do define a notion of extreme, minimum and maximum, basically, and we can get around the problem. So who knows? But yeah, it's a very interesting question, in my opinion.
So do you think it's do you think that's a sort of a hazard to like good OSP mechanisms, or it's just that these kinds of templates that people have used in the past don't apply in this case? So you think it's like a serious hazard in terms of there is no sort of non-trivial approximation through OSP mechanisms for, you know, significantly general multi-parameter domains?
This is purely
guessing,
speculation.
right? So,
this is purely speculation. I don't know. It's possible that, you know, for example, if you had the notion of multidimensional domains where you do have a sort of lattice structure, so you can order, probably you can make it work. But I wouldn't know in general. Yeah.
More questions?
Hi, Carmine.
Hi, Arjun.
How about the revenue of OSP mechanisms compared to standard mechanisms? I mean, if an OSP mechanism has higher revenue, then it's good enough for me. Right?
Yeah, I mean, in general, having to do with stupid people is better for revenue, right? So it might be true. But yeah, I don't know. It's a good question, and I don't know. Yeah, but yeah, you might need to go to even simpler settings, probably, right? Not even combinatorial. Yeah.
Okay, more questions for Carmine. That doesn't seem to be the case. Well, then, thank you again for being here and for presenting the paper. Okay, then finally we move on to the last entry, which is the outer limits of contention resolution on matroids and connections to the secretary problem.
Okay, so I'm going to try and share my slides here. All right.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to be brief. I prepared a couple of slides. I guess I was assuming that people watch the talk. I'm not sure how reasonable that is, but if you have any questions, let me know. So, in this paper, study contention resolution when there's correlation in the inputs. Prior work mostly was concerned with independent inputs, and those results typically generalize to some definitions of negative correlation. And this is largely because there's nothing possible in general when you have arbitrary positive correlation. So the starting point of the paper is that we observe that the positive correlation that arises in the wild is often benign, at least for offline contention resolution. So our results are twofold. First, we show that these benign correlated distributions have a nice finite inequality characterization, and this characterization has some pretty insightful and useful implications. And then second, we show that resolving contention online in the random arrival model for these benign positive correlated distributions is a core technical challenge, and I argue the core technical challenge of the Matroid secretary problem. Here's a brief informal summary of the results. So just very briefly, first, we characterize these distributions that permit offline competitive contention resolution. This includes many positively correlated distributions. And then we derive some immediate implications from this characterization. And then second, we reduce the Matroid secretary conjecture to and from what we call universal online contention resolution in the random arrival model. And by universal, I mean that you should be able to do online almost as well as you do offline for all these distributions that have benign positive correlation. And so that's it. I'm going to leave this up and take any questions.
Good, thank you. Questions for Shadon?
So is this like all these contention resolution definitions, and does it also work for like a multi-set system? So if you look at like Polymatroids?
One direction of our reduction. So are you talking about the characterization?
Yeah, I mean, just anything like if this is well defined also. I mean, because I guess.
Yes. Yeah, contention resolution is defined very generally for downward closed set systems or packing style constraints. So some of our results only hold for Matroids, and some of them extend beyond Matroids, and I talk about that a little bit in the paper. But the focus is mostly on Matroids because it's already hard enough with a positive correlation on Matroids, I guess.
But so also if you would have like sort of a non-negative integer vector, so to say, like if instead, because now it's always like a 0-1 problem, but if it could be like anything like 0, 1, 2, 3.
Oh, I see. So you're talking about lattices.
Yeah, like it's sometimes referred to as like discrete polymatroids or something.
Yeah, so I haven't seen work on that, but I can imagine there'd be natural generalizations there. Although for some reason, I guess I haven't seen too much work on contention resolution with lattices. Is that kind of what you're asking, basically?
No, so I vaguely recall, like you also mentioned, like profit inequalities in the talk.
Yes.
And there
yes,
you
yes,
also have
yes.
like extension to like polymatroid profit inequalities or something. So I was just wondering about, in general, if this also is like studied
yes.
for those type of.
Good. So there's reductions from profit inequalities to contention resolution and vice versa. Those reductions go through linear programming. So one of the open questions that I mentioned in the paper is basically, do those reductions work when there's positive correlation? And perhaps now this tells you maybe analogous to this characterization that we have, maybe there's also a characterization of when can you prove profit inequalities when there's correlation or positive correlation. So there is a kind of a close connection between contention resolution and profit inequalities in the independent setting. It's not clear to what extent that connection remains when you have these correlations. And that's a super interesting question, actually. I would love it if someone took a look at that.
Okay, thank you.
So if I understand this correctly, the first result is mainly a characterization of these schemes. Do you see any like quick or sort of direct, more or less direct consequences for like approximation algorithms that use this kind of contention resolution? Is there like a profit from this characterization that you can make things better, more general, do the things differently because you know this is the way it works?
Yeah, so most of the approximation algorithms that use contention resolution in the rounding step, they actually only usually typically have independent distributions, because you basically have a solution to the LPX and then you round it independently and then you apply contention resolution. However, in some settings, like in stochastic optimization settings, actually the rounding is more complicated. And actually in the case of bipartite matching and more general matching that happens, I mentioned this in the talk, where the rounding is more complicated, there's multiple steps, and you introduce correlation before you run the contention resolution. So in those cases, I can see this characterization helping you identify what rounding algorithms you could possibly resolve contention for without losing too much in the approximation. So so I guess it can be a tool to guide the design of rounding algorithms. and you can possibly look at some of the existing results. I guess you haven't checked this. You can possibly look at some of the existing results maybe in this lens. But I don't have any specific killer application for this in approximation algorithm. I guess I haven't really thought about that.
I see. What's your guess for the Matroid secretary conjecture?
So I'm 50-50. But
can I briefly jump in? Can I briefly jump in? The award session is going on, and we need a few people from this session. If Artur is still around, we need him in the award session. Thank you.
All right.
So I guess let me just say one more thing.
Yeah.
So either way, I think it's actually equivalent to this universal online.
Okay. So you think the answer is yes, there is a constant competitive algorithm for this Matroid case?
So I got 50-50, but either way, like you say, you can't have answers. You reduce the number of questions. So I think it's the same question as basically the same question as the following: Is online random arrival contention resolution as powerful as offline? I think basically those two, Matroid secretary conjecture and that question, are equivalent.
Good. More questions for Sharon. All right, then let's thank Sharon and let's thank everyone who was here for the Q&A and for presenting the papers. Yeah, thank you for showing up. Thank you for making this interesting and lively. And yeah, I hope you all stay safe and maybe see you at the award session. Anyway, take care. Bye.
Yeah, thank you for hosting as well, Martin.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Martin. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.